Welcome to Art Power Hong Kong, a collaborative campaign from the Hong Kong art community celebrating the arts in Hong Kong in 2020. I'm Lavina Lee Cadman, Art Power Hong Kong's working group member, and I'm delighted that you are joining us for the 5th installment of the weekly Art Power Hong Kong online talks program. Today's discussion is a follow-on from Talk 3 in the Art Power Hong Kong talk series, in which we look at the sustainability for the art world. We will be exploring how the art world can effectively address and reduce its carbon footprint with a study of David Greybeard's A Touring Public Art Installation by Lisa Roet that has taken environmental impact into consideration at every step along the way. It is my pleasure to introduce you to my colleague and your moderator for today, Sarah Pringle, co-founder of Art Partners. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Lavina. That's great. So for the talk today, as Lavina mentioned, we are going to be looking at the case study of a project by the artist Lisa Roet. The project's called David Greybeard. And Lisa her practice has been spanning 30 years, investigating primates, habitat, climate change, and endangered species. And what Lisa will do is very briefly introduce you to her practice. We're focusing more on the public art projects that she's been doing in recent years. She'll then talk about the particular project, which is David Greybeard. And then from there, Michael can take over, and he will talk more about the analysis of the carbon footprint. Now, Michael is the utilities manager at RMIT in Melbourne. It's an art, design and technology university, and he's responsible for the admissions profile of the university, which has successfully managed to reduce its carbon footprint by nearly 50% since 2007. And my understanding is, Michael, your aim is to have a carbon neutral university by 2030.
Yep,
so he's
right.
working at the kind of forefront of how we calculate and manage emissions, which has been really exciting, learning about that. Now, Michael has been working with Lisa on specifically the David Greybeard project, which we're featuring today. And he will then explain to us later on how we practically analyze and study the carbon and the environmental impact of a project. And then at the end of the project, with the inevitable carbon footprint, which we aim to have as small as possible, he can then, explain to us how the best way that we offset the carbon footprint. So to start, Lisa, we'll go on. We have a slideshow which I hope that everybody's able to see who's dialing in. We'll kick off with this first slide, which was the first public art project of this scale that you did for your Golden Monkey. Perhaps you can explain a little bit about that, Lisa.
So this was the first of this series of these larger inflatable biodiversity projects that I've been doing globally now. It started where I had a residency in Beijing, and I had a conversation with the then director of, one of the key people at the opposite house in Beijing, one of the Swire properties. And I said, oh, wouldn't it be great to celebrate the Year of the Monkey, which was 2016. And he responded very favourably to that. And so I decided to embark on making a work especially for that Chinese New Year, Year of the Monkey. But it was really about a way of highlighting the state of primates at the moment in the environment. So this was the first of the series, and it was launched on the actual day of Year of the Monkey, the Chinese New Year, and it was on the Melbourne Town Hall. And it was part of a festival, an outdoor festival.
So it's interesting because obviously your previous work that I'd seen prior to 2016, you did works on paper, you did video, photography, your practice was, I guess, what you would say in more traditional medium. So obviously you've got this idea to do the Golden Monkey. What led you into working in this particular medium? Did the medium come first and you felt I want to do work with this medium, or was it the other way around?
No, my mediums always come second to me. So I always work with an idea or where I want to present that idea. And then I start thinking about the medium that I use to portray that idea. So the conceptual nature of my practice really leads leads the works that I make. So the idea of this was very much celebrating Year of the Monkey, and was looking at this, you know, the notion also using the town hall was almost that French 19th century sort of way of the use of monkeys to portray the human element, you know, to somehow throw a light on humanity. And that's always something that I've tried to achieve in my practice. As I'll give you a science lesson now, as some people may or may not know, we are actually primates. We are actually apes in the family of ape, in the science, as a science sort of terminology. So it was sort of highlighting the fact that we are part of this family, and I wanted to highlight some of the issues facing deforestation and environmental degradation at the moment.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And as part of, yeah, sorry, and that is one of the messages that have gone through with my practice for the last 30 years.
And then you obviously then sourced out somebody who could make something out of this scale, because doing it in a traditional medium would just be so impractical to make something that is kind of 8-9 meters.
Exactly. And so when I first had the idea, it was I was going to cast it in bronze, and it was going to be, you know, 9 meters tall. And then I realized it was probably going to cost about $300,000 just to cast it. It would weigh so much that no building could possibly have it on its side. Its carbon footprint would have been ridiculous. It would have been one use. It would have had to have stayed there. So all these impracticalities that come along with these great ideas. So I then thought, well, maybe I could try and find a very lightweight material that was metallic in nature. And then someone who in the festival suggested that maybe I could work through inflation. And I found a partner, who I work with up until today, called Felipe Reynolds, who's from a company design. And we pushed boundaries of that design rather than the traditional way of using inflatable objects, which is more a printed process. We've sort of really worked with this hand-stitched, detailed work to create the fur texture and the hair, and to create all the detail that I wanted that would be similar to if it was cast in bronze.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so successful about these projects. They really do look solid and real when they're up there on the building. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we'll go on to the next project as well, because that then came a kind of extension. What I thought was quite interesting is when you did that first project, the amount of attention that you received for the artwork, but I think more importantly for the causes that are very close to you in terms of shining a light on those issues. And that seemed to get a lot of attention from other people around the world. Yeah.
And I think that's it. I think it's the partnerships that I hold with these projects that are really important to them. This was a place called Appenhol in Holland, in Apeldoorn. And they're a conservation group, especially focused on primates, monkeys and greater apes. And they approached me about they've got a new gorilla in their midst, so to speak, and they wanted their community to embrace this new gorilla, and they wanted to highlight the important work that they're doing. So they invited me to design a work around that gorilla and place it on their town hall. So once again, it's placing the ape in a very, I suppose, this political environment, the political man side of nature, which I think is a really nice combination and a really nice juxtaposition between the ape in this urban environment. Yeah. And it got a lot of attention, this work. You know, there was an article in the Dutch Financial Review that compared it to a new public sculpture that was in Amsterdam, and they actually stated this work as being what a successful public art should do, because it talks about, it has a meaning and purpose, whereas some of the other public artworks don't. They decided.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's what's very interesting in your practice, that this evolution of you having something that it inspires your work. It's something that you're interested in, but what's happened over the years is it's now really tapped into a wider environmental message. And so the work now has this ability to raise awareness of particular issues. And it's interesting that conservation groups and people are coming to you to want to kind of engage with your practice and have a partnership to highlight these issues.
Yeah, and I love that combination, because my work over the years has has taken the pathway of working with scientists and conservationists just naturally through my investigation into my subject matter. And I spend a lot of time with primatologists and with conservationists now, because sadly a lot of the places that I visit to research my subject are now being degraded very dramatically.
Yeah.
So it's a relationship that's quite natural, actually, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the interesting thing with your work is that combination. You work very closely with scientists. So, you know, obviously we're going to bring on to Michael in a minute about a different relationship, but it's just that combination of bringing together different disciplines and just the power that the art has in terms of engaging with a wider audience and getting those messages out.
And I think that's it, that, you know, works. They're quite simple in their approach. You know, they are what they are. That's a gorilla on a tower. It could resemble, I suppose, King Kong. It makes people question, why is it there? Why is it in Holland? You know, why is a gold monkey in Melbourne on a town hall? And in fact, that can often be a problem that people have. They go, well, why don't we have a koala on the town hall rather than a monkey that's from China? But because it's unexpected, it's actually what creates the interest, and it's what generates the press, it generates the PR, it generates the social media content. It's a really interesting thing, actually, and it's working really well.
That's fantastic. I'll bring you on to something. Obviously, we're Art Power Hong Kong, so our audience is a Hong Kong audience. So yeah. I would hope that a lot of people that are maybe signing in today will recognise this. This was a project that we did in partnership with Henderson for H Code. What I thought was quite interesting is Henderson were really pushing the boundaries in terms of trying to make their development more environmentally sustainable. So this project matched very well with what they were trying to do in their business. And they kind of were drawn to you as an artist because you're trying to sort of highlight the effects of climate change, which is affecting, obviously, species, which is where the kind of golden snub-nosed monkey project came out of. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about that background. Yeah.
Well, exactly. Like the sneezing snub-nose was a newly discovered monkey that was found in Yunnan, and it was by a scientist who'd heard villagers over talking in a very high altitude village about an ancestor that had heard herbs in the higher altitude. He said that the ancestor was sick and was sneezing, and the scientists understood that it wouldn't be a sneezing ancestor, but rather probably a new species of animal. So they went up and they found this new species of monkey and they termed it the sneezing snub-nose. It was sneezing because the snub-nosed monkeys have a very small upturned nose, which has actually defrosted and fallen off over thousands of years of evolutionary mutation. And because of global warming, these very frozen areas are now dripping precipitation. And the precipitation is getting into the noses of these monkeys and they're sneezing the water out. So I saw it as a symbol of global warming. I also was interested in the scientific element of that and the research and the endeavour of these scientists in finding this monkey. And the other issue that I wanted to highlight was this increasing urbanisation and how so many elements of nature, so many animals are now moving into urban environments in order to survive.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. We're taking this particular work. We'll be going to Singapore for Chelsfield ARA, and in their development, what's been really interesting for us with our clients, we're seeing that they are taking on board, the issues of sustainability, the impacts on urbanization, as you're saying, and how they can do more to kind of minimize their carbon footprint. And I think it's interesting with your projects and the project we're highlighting today is how there are changes, and with that particular client at Chelsfield in Singapore, they're also now looking into how we can, inspired by the David Greybeard, how we can also make our project down there zero carbon. And so that's feeding into sort of all aspects. And I think, that's the interesting thing about the project that you've been doing. I'm going to show this one as well. This was, as you said, the Swire relationship that you had. And there's a small video I'll play, which you can maybe talk over. I'll make sure the volume is down. Perhaps you can explain this to us, because I like the relationship you had with the university here for Earth Day.
So we did this project. I did this in collaboration with the Opposite House. It was to celebrate Earth Hour. It was a huge amount of effort, but really it was up for about 2 weeks, three weeks, but it was one night for Earth Hour that we did it with bike power. So all the electricity was generated to create the inflation of the work. This work create a small amount of electricity, which Michael will talk to on. So I wanted to work out how I could offset that or draw attention to the fact that everything we do does create energy, and we need to work out how we can provide that energy or offset that energy. So we made it into a part of the work. So in fact, it was actually part of the creative element of this was to have the bikes there, have the manpower. China it's one of its greatest assets is its people. So the people all got together, and there were hundreds of people lined up to have this fun, to contribute to this really fun event of riding the bicycles to create generate the energy to inflate the work. It was a really beautiful project, that one. It also had a saber. It was called the Skywalker gibbon. It was once again a newly discovered gibbon, discovered in Yunnan again. It's very endangered, like all these primates. This beautiful Skywalker gibbon also was named the Skywalker because the lead of the science team is a Chinese scientist who loves Luke Skywalker. So he decided to call it the Skywalker gibbon. Which, we're gone are the days of the Latin naming, of the 1800s in that great age of discovery. So I love that it was an American icon named by a Chinese scientist. So what we had was a saber, like Luke Skywalker's saber, and that saber was designed to look at pollution. So the beam from the saber actually traveled through pollution. So there's this interesting thing going on in Beijing with the American embassy saying that the pollution count is, say, 800, and the Chinese news agency saying it's 90. So I decided to use my own form. This artwork created the beacon of what the pollution was on that day. And the further that the saber light went, the further the pollution counter was. So it was a really interesting project, and I worked with a lot of different people on that to make that work.
I mean, I think this is what's quite interesting in how you're, for the purposes of this talk, which we're talking about, this is, making a project as sustainable as possible. I love the fact that your work has evolved from its primary focus is raising awareness to now you've begun to look at your own practice and how you can actually affect your own carbon footprint. And I think, as I mentioned before, that's happening with, this is something that's tapping into something that is happening all over the world. And perhaps you can explain to us then your relationship with RMIT and the Jane Goodall Institute when you came to create David Greybeard.
Well, the Jane Goodall Institute approached me. They'd been seeing these projects. I've done some work with Jane in the past, and they approached me and said, it's Jane's anniversary in 2020 for her incredible work that she did in Gombe in 1960. And would I consider trying to do a large project to highlight that anniversary? The Institute didn't want to put money into it, and they don't have the money to put into a big art project. So I decided to approach the Art Centre here in Victoria, so Creative Victoria, and they have supported the making of this work. The design came about with me designing it with Jane, and I asked her what chimpanzee she wanted to focus on, and she asked to focus on a chimpanzee called David Greybeard, who's a very important chimpanzee in her research. When we talked about it and she realised how big these projects are, I think at first she thought it was going to be something that scale. And then when she realised it's not that scale and it's a very big, she was very concerned about the footprint of the work. And, she's an incredible woman. She recycles everything. She doesn't waste anything on anything. She wears the same clothing over and over again and looks after it and washes it carefully. And she doesn't, she doesn't invest in consumerism. And she was worried that she would be seen as representing a large work that footprint hadn't been thought out. The beautiful thing about these inflatable works is, one, the footprint is quite low, and Michael will talk about that later. So it is actually a very practical way of presenting a very large, high impact work globally with a very, very low footprint. Because in fact, these 12 metre works, this one, which is 12 by 9 by 9 metres, will end up packing up into a box that's maybe 1.2 metres by 1 metre by 1.5 at the biggest, at the most. So that Michael will talk about the offset of that. That will be the equivalent of, an economy fare, maybe touring. I also then realised, I looked into the materials and I looked into the sewing. There's a very small amount of energy that's used. It's all hand sewn. The material use is probably its biggest impact. It's got about 600 metres of material in it. So we looked at that and we decided to create an offset campaign to go along with this project, which one is the first time I've thought about doing that. I've considered the materials I use, but I hadn't really understood, when I really delve into what I'm doing, even from the bubble wrap that I use, or have used in the past, through to bronze or casting, what that entails as far as the materials and the energy use. So this project really, through Jane, has made me start focusing on that. And I really, in the future, every project I do, I'll be looking at that at the beginning of the project and consider it as part of the cycle of the project.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I think this may be, obviously, RMIT are in Melbourne. You were doing this project, it's fabricated in Melbourne. So that's obviously the relationship. This may be a good time maybe to sort of bring Michael into the conversation. And Michael, you can talk about how obviously your work deals more with the actual university, the building, the energy used, a bigger practical issues of, in a sense, of development. How did you start to approach working with Lisa? Because obviously something like this has got lots of different issues in terms of the making of work and working with the artist.
Yeah, definitely. So thanks for having me along. So I work at the university, and sort of what you alluded to is I work within the property team, so responsible for the environmental footprint of the university as a whole. And in looking at this project, I guess seeing it as a sort of smaller, shrunk down version of what I look at a university scale. So I guess Lisa's approached me as Lisa's had a long-standing relationship with the university in producing a number of key pieces of artwork that we prominently display across the university already. So it was probably a pretty good fit to begin with. But I guess in starting to understand what this works was, I really wanted to sort of break it down and understand the physical form in which Lisa was creating. So I guess a quick summary here on the slide is, a fabrication of a 9-metre tall chimpanzee sitting outside the art centre, as Lisa mentioned, a relatively lightweight sculpture, primarily made of metallic material, with an internal truss system and 2 inbuilt fans, giving that inflated sort of look to create the size and the scale without the large casting. So really a few meetings there with Lisa to understand the components that will go into this, and also I guess chasing a few of the different invoices to actually get the specifications of the materials as well that were a part of it. So if we jump onto the next slide. So of course, looking at the carbon footprint of the art in this instance, given the strong ties with the Jane Goodall Institute as part of the piece of artwork, I mean, it's fundamental. I mean, the Jane Goodall Institute is a holistic conservation organisation looking to preserve natural habitats and also enhance them globally. So if the purpose of this artwork is to raise awareness on this, I mean, it sort of goes without saying that we need to consider the footprint of the artwork itself. So we started to undertake this process of, I guess, understanding what the footprint would be. So if we jump to the next slide. So a couple of sort of questions, and this is sort of the approach I sort of took with my line of questioning to Lisa sort of behind the scenes, was we really needed to draw a boundary here. So what were we looking at? Were we looking at the artwork? Were we looking at the creation of it? Are we looking at the transportation of it around the world, where it is potentially going to go into in its future? And then also what's happening afterwards. So we needed to define that boundary. and we define that boundary around the physical form and where that would take from, I guess, cradle to grave in this instance. So sort of a process diagram was ultimately created. So what were the inputs? In this case, relatively easy. Those inputs sort of came from the invoicing of all the materials that were purchased in this instance to create it. Also mentioned with any carbon footprinting process, there's got to be a lot of assumptions and estimations you have to put into it. You're not going to know every minute detail of every single item right trace back to its source. So you need to make appropriate assumptions and estimations, but you need to be cautious about those. So you need to apply what's called the precautionary principle or a conservative based approach. So the key elements within the David Greybeard installation really drilled down to 4 main areas and sort of buckets for which we calculated the emissions. So fabrication, the raw materials themselves, and the labour that goes into creating it. So this is all of Lisa's hard work to create the piece. The second bucket is transportation. So it's obviously going to have a life here in Melbourne and then eventually a life at various different places around the world, hence the purpose of it, to raise awareness amongst different communities. The exhibition itself, so the installation, the local installation of it and setting up, and the small amount of resources it may consume in terms of the electricity to run the fans and some lighting on it. And then what is the approach around disposal? And I guess this process of really understanding, well, what's going to happen to it? Are we going to design this thing to be disassembled? Do we have an end vision for this process? And I must stress that this whole process of asking questions throughout it is part of why you do the carbon footprinting as well. It's starting to question some of the fundamentals of what fabrics are used here. What is the method of transportation? And in querying these, you know, somebody, whether it be the artist or whether it be somebody in the supply chain, may be able to take away some lessons and then start to apply this to their future products or future artwork that they create and learn these lessons and share these lessons with others as well. So if we jump to the next slide. Getting into the bones of the detail of it. So when it all sort of came out in the wash with all the numbers, so I looked into all the fabrics that were going into this, and we made some sort of assumptions based on the distance of fabric that was to be purchased, and there's always some miscellaneous items in here as well. When I say miscellaneous, you have things like zips and ties and little components as well. So you've got to apply some assumptions to those characteristics. So we found out the fabrication component of it and the raw materials came to just over 4 tons of CO2. To put that in perspective, the fabrication component, that is about half of the footprint of a family household operating for a year. So it's quite considerable, but I mean, it is quite a considerable artwork as well. If you think about it in terms of the materials a household in, say, Australia would be consuming, they're not going to be consuming 500 meters worth of fabric and truss points and stuff as well. But really, you know, the largest portion here is going to be into the transportation of it. And what this really highlights is that the proposed transport routes for the item is to get a piece of this size and scale to other significant locations in the world. Air travel is going to be the quickest and logical choice for the transportation of this piece. So transportation will make up a large footprint of this as well. And this really puts into perspective, when a lot of people think about carbon footprints, they think about the flights they take. That is sort of the go-to tangible item for, you know, the mums and dads there at home. That's what they first sort of were exposed to for carbon footprints as well. You know, that box you could potentially tick when you're taking a flight. And then just finally, those other two items there, the exhibition and the disposal of the item as well, or the ultimate disposal of it at the end of its life, are relatively insignificant in the scheme of the project. The consumption of electricity for the running of the fans and the lighting around it are not actually that large when it's considered. And the disposal itself, as much as we're also going to consider some reuse aspects to pulling the final piece apart, we find that that disposal element is relatively, compared to the rest of the profile, relatively insignificant. So if you go to the next slide, I think we've got a breakdown as a percentage.
Yeah.
So this really sort of puts it into this this scale, you know, transportation being about 2/3 of the overall footprint, fabrication being the other third, and the other two are really minor aspects in the scheme of things. I should probably also mention the approach around the emissions. You know, multiple different calculators out there for this, but obviously a piece of public art like this is relatively bespoke. A lot of companies that will create calculators for this sort of look at, you know, personal emissions rather than, you know, public art. So we need to use programs like Open LCA or life cycle analysis. These are some publicly available programs that can be used, looking at the materials that are going into it. Some calculations around electricity and emissions. And you can also use, there's a range of different emissions factors that are publicly accessible, both locally here in Australia. There are Australian federal government emissions calculators that are provided and sheets, but one of the most comprehensive ones are actually distributed by the UK government. So the UK government releases annual greenhouse gas emissions conversion factors, and they can be publicly downloaded off their websites. And, you know, with a bit of reading through the how to use guides, you can really get your head around it eventually. But this whole process, I guess, is also going to be a learning exercise. And the idea is that, you know, these kind of questions that we're asking are really going to start to encourage change and consideration from different suppliers and how they're providing things, and potentially even maybe different transportation methods might be considered now, because this is potentially the highlight, is that transportation is a large component here.
I mean, I'd like to, I know you still have more in your presentation, but yep. I think especially for the audience that's here, we did a talk, talk 3 was about sustainability in the art world. And I think one of the reasons why we're doing this talk today is actually just showing a practical example about what you can do in terms of actually making your practice more sustainable. Obviously in the art world, transportation is the biggest, is going to be the biggest issue, as it is in Lisa's project. And I know we had a conversation earlier. I was quite interested to know the differences between, say, shipping and air, because there does seem to be a lot of debate as to which one is more sustainable, because maybe in terms of carbon, you know, emissions going into the atmosphere, potentially shipping is a lot better. But then there's other issues that you have to consider in terms of the wider environmental impact. Perhaps you can explain a bit about that.
So that's a really good question, because you've probably touched on 2 key issues here. So one around the transportation. Realistically, to get any item from one point in the world to another, you're going to have to use some method of transportation to physically get it there. Those primarily are air travel and shipping, typically in you know, a shipping container into a cargo ship. So I've actually gone and had a sort of bit of a delve into some of the emissions factors that are used and accepted in the UK for this. And if you were to ship it, and bear in mind, both of these transportation methods have their own limitations to them as well. One obviously gets there a lot quicker than the other, and that can be the make or break in your decision making. But if you were to ship it on a cargo ship, the emissions from that process would be 70 times less than flying it. So
70.
Yep.
Wow.
So this is what you really get with the economies of scale. So you've all seen, you know, images of those large cargo ships that go around the world, they can just transport such a sheer amount of weight in one go, and with relatively small resistance from the water as they're going, despite the fuel they have to burn to continue to move. They are able to transport just such a large volume of weight in comparison to what can fit on a plane. And so I guess it's the emissions per ton kilometre is 70 times less for shipping than it is for air travel. But you might be able to make that decision to change that shipping method occasionally, but acknowledging that time can be a very, very strong consideration, can be your driving force. The other point you touched on there was the overall environmental footprint. So when you're consuming resources, there can be a lot of debate around this as well, is that to do an environmental footprint, you may look at the overall use of resources of an item, and also the impacts into that local community where those resources are consumed. Now, in order to calculate that and to sort of bring it to a comparable number is often fraught with contention, because environmental impacts in one area may be very different to environmental impacts in another area. So often, and what we're seeing a lot of, I guess, assessments sort of congealing around is this concept of emissions. Emissions essentially can draw something back to a single number that can be interpreted, and over time, as this becomes more and more popular, can be eventually understood by the general public as well. Find it's often good to put it in the context of, the emissions of a family house or of a single person in a year. And so the sort of that's what led us to focusing on the carbon footprint of this specifically, an easier, more tangible number to calculate.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Probably goes to the next slide as well.
Which obviously then brings us on to the offsetting. I think in the conversations I've been having with you and Lisa as well, and I know that this is something that's been discussed widely, as you said, on the transport. Okay, I can fly as much as I like, and then I just click this button and I absolve myself of any. I'm now zero carbon. So I don't think we're kind of proposing that this is just a magic fix for what we do. But I do think that, as you can explain more about how we choose, proper carbon offsetting, of course, will make a significant difference in terms of balancing our projects and balancing what we do in our day-to-day.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, ultimately, for a project of any nature to go ahead and of any activity, whether it be the university in operation, or whether it be this art piece, ultimately you're going to be consuming resources, you're going to be using energy. We all do this in our day-to-day life. You will never get this as an individual to zero, no matter where you are in the world. You are consuming energy, you are causing some form of impact. So let's be clear, you can never have a absolute zero impact activity. But what carbon offsetting does allow you to do is look to make contributions toward other projects which are doing the opposite. They're pulling emissions out by the nature of their activities. So a couple of examples here in the slides: forestry or tree planting projects, renewable energy, avoiding fossil fuel burning for the creation of electricity, energy efficiency more broadly across organizations. Not using energy in the first place is a reduction in energy and ultimately in carbon. And there are many other projects available as well. But what this really talks to is balancing the calculation of the footprint of the project versus an equivalent amount of offsets to be purchased. So if you go to the next slide.
So this is now focusing particularly on this project, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so exactly. Now, when you go out and look for purchasing offsets, there's a huge world out there. You could say, well, why pick this project over this project? Why pick a project in Australia versus a project in China versus a project somewhere in Europe? How do I know to pick one over the other? It's extremely important that you pick a project that has and the appropriate linking in to the messaging you're trying to display here. And before I get into the ones for this project, an example for RMIT, we've been purchasing offsets for a number of years at the university. And we've purchased offsets located in Vietnam because we have a very, very large campus. We're one of the largest education providers in Vietnam. So we've purchased projects around renewable energy generation in Vietnam that helps support the development of renewable energy in those local communities. I think particularly for an offshore wind farm, and also for a hydro dam in Vietnam as well. So you need to be able to pick a project that really is consistent with your messaging. Otherwise, you really open yourself up for criticism because there are, you can be seen to be just doing a sort of tick box exercise, which doesn't really tell the story and arguably sort of misses the point. So the items we're currently looking into for the David Greybeard project is obviously with the Jane Goodall Institute. There's a huge tie-in here with the overall conservation direction that the Jane Goodall Institute has. There's actually a program that they operate called the Roots and Shoots program, which operates around the world. And specifically, they've actually joined in with a commitment with the United Nations Environment Program as part of their 1 trillion trees campaign to plant 1 trillion trees around the world. So the Jane Goodall Institute is explicitly looking to support for creating or to planting up to 5 million trees as part of their efforts. So it really makes sense that if we can offset this project through a financial contribution that can provide an equivalent number of trees to offset or even exceed the number of the emissions of this program, then I think it really connects this whole story right round to say, well, the whole point of raising the awareness through a large-scale David Greybeard is through the work that the Jane Goodall Institute does, through the awareness of the deforestation and destruction of habitats for chimpanzees and other animals around the world. And if we can then put the money for the carbon offsets back into a program that is assisting this, it absolutely helps the message and creates that whole circular story here.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Michael. I think that, the carbon for this particular project in terms of the David Greybeard, is Lisa, was talking about earlier. I mean, that's what's been really interesting. And I think it's also interesting, Lisa, that you said that for you, certainly, this is now going to become part of your practice. This is now, this way of working will now be kind of embedded in what you do. I thought that was very interesting.
And I think, that's that thing of knowledge, isn't it? The second you know something, it's very hard to do something about something when you know about it. And that's what I'm learning. I mean, I learned through Michael. When I went to Michael, I originally went to RMIT to ask them to sponsor this project. I'm an alumni of RMIT Art Department. They jumped on board, and one of the things I said I wanted to do was to do this carbon offset around the art project. And the department there, Grace Leon, who I'm working with, she said she organised through the sustainability department for me to meet Michael to discuss that further. And when I went to Michael, I was really green with this. I knew I wanted to do it, but I didn't know what I was doing at all. And he's, as you can tell, such a great explainer, and he's worked so clearly with me to work out a route forward with this project that's functioning, and makes sense. And, I think this circular motion is just fantastic because it's a win-win situation. And for me, it actually adds to the conceptual nature of my art project. Yep. So for me, it actually comes full circle back into the artwork. So I think it's great. It also has opened up the eyes of the Jane Goodall Institute as well. It's pushing them into working out their own offset program, and I think it's a chain reaction that it starts. It's really great.
I think it's been, it's especially, say, Lavina and I, on a personal note, Lavina and I, in terms of art partners, just by working with you on the project and working with Michael and looking at it, what I like, how we describe it, almost like an environmental impact audit. We're used to auditing our business in terms of, the financial and staffing.
Yeah, exactly.
But just that environmental impact. And as you said, Michael, once you start, maybe it isn't a perfect exact science. At this stage, we can't, necessarily look at every minutiae, but once you start looking at those, kind of breaking it down as you have done for this project, and looking down at the simple, the transport, the energy use, fabrication, etc. And I think, you know, certainly Lavina and I have made a kind of pledge that this is now going to become part of our standard business practice. You know, this is how we're going to operate from now on. And I know that's what Lisa's doing. And I think one of the objectives from this talk, as I said, which was a follow-on from already an existing talk with Art Power, is that there is an interest. People do want to, you know, they're looking at sustainability. You know, people are asking those questions, and the more that we can be informed and understand what changes we can make, and how, as you said with this carbon offsetting, we can negate the inevitable changes so that it creates a balance in how we live our life. You know?
And I think,
yep.
I think that's part of it as well, is that when you start delving into it, it's a bit scary. You sort of go, oh my God, I have used that plastic. It's like, you know, not using a plastic bag. Yeah. And you realize how ingrained it is in part of your life, and you've almost got to relieve yourself of that addiction. And it's not being afraid to be honest about what you're doing. And I think that's a problem with this industry up to date, that people are too scared to open up the can of worms, you know, and to own the fact that they have created this carbon issue that they need to deal with. And as Michael said, no one will create a zero emissions. You know, you are, just by your pure existence, causing an issue that you need to think about. But there are ways of thinking about it and doing it. The other thing with this project, because there is a lot of material and it will degrade, these inflatable works degrade. They have only a certain lifespan. But most of the material is still in good shape. It's just certain areas will wear out, and it won't be able to be used as a sculpture. So what we're intending to do is cut that material down, and it'll be packaged up and donated to different textile institutes around the world who are working with sustainable fabric and textile design. And then they can recreate that work, and it'll be through the Jane Goodall Institute as well, into bags or jumpers or whatever they want to do with that material, and then hopefully resell that as a way of fundraising back into the Jane Goodall Institute. So it's this sort of cycle that keeps going around and around until we hope there's literally a pool of threads, and then maybe at that point it can be turned into something else as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic, and I know that it was something that we did again with a client in Hong Kong, in Chelsfield, where we did a big hoarding project. And from the offset of that project, we then designed it in such a way that we could then reuse all of the panels that we used as the public art project, and now put into public areas in like car parks and other kind of areas that aren't usually so, you know, they look so good. And so it kind of had this life. So we took them down and we reframed them, and then we, you know, repurposed them in the other parts of the development. And I think you're right, you know, Lisa, once you open that can of worms, once you start thinking about it, and with the help of experts like Michael, who come from a completely different discipline, and you really kind of force us to question and to look, and then also to advise on statements like you made, just talking about decisions that we can make in our practice in terms of whether we ship a work or we air freight a work. Understanding that it's not just a simple choice, you know, there's other factors, but looking into those choices and hopefully making the ones that are better for the environment.
Yeah, and I think there's huge value in just asking the question. I think there's almost more value in the questions that it raises than the activity itself. So that's the important thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, talking of questions, if anybody who is listening and who signed in, please, I believe you can kind of message on the system. If there's any particular question you want to ask Michael or Lisa, please send it through. We have another 10 minutes before the talk ends, so we're happy to answer those particular questions. But I mean, I know I have some in terms of Michael, you know, the carbon offsetting. While we've been doing this, having these conversations, and you know, I've had a bit of information about various programs, and I thought you were absolutely, you know, right in terms of it has to be relevant, but also how do we ensure that these companies are going to do what they say they're going to do? I think that's certainly, and maybe I'm a bit maybe that's the cynical side of me, but I know when I chose not to click the button on the flights for those carbon offset programs. Instead, my husband and I, we donate to planting trees in a particular project that we know that's here locally for us in the UK. But how would we, as in a commercial operation, how would we do that? What's your best advice on ensuring that the money is going to the correct place?
Yep. So here, essentially, credibility is key. So, you know, you don't want your money not to be going to the right place here. So the way that these areas work, a lot of countries will have their own accredited systems for accounting for emissions, and this is a global standard since all countries around the world signed up to what was called the Kyoto Protocol many years ago, and has been now sort of superseded with things like the Paris Agreement. These kind of agreements not only sort of set direction on addressing climate change around the world, but they actually set some fundamental structures on how emissions are calculated. So that's all well and good when you have something within one country alone. But when you're looking, I guess, into sort of other communities or even outside of the local government's sort of mandated boundaries, what you want to start looking at is the voluntary carbon markets. Now the voluntary carbon markets are markets which are entered into by a range of different participants, essentially buyers and sellers. And those sellers are essentially project owners around the world who, as I mentioned before, may run a range of different projects from energy efficiency to renewable energy to the creation of different stove cooktops for local communities. All of these projects have some inherent value in the emissions that they are avoiding or sequestering through what they're doing. And that by entering into sort of contracts and documentation, entering into contracts with these voluntary organizations, they essentially have documentation requirements and authenticity that needs to be created to ensure that those emissions are definitely being saved and are additional to their business as usual activities. So voluntary carbon markets too that have really sort of come to the fore globally. One is called the Verified Carbon Standard, or VCS. That's a very reputable one globally. And the second one is called the Gold Standard. Now, both of these standards are ones, and the reason I do know of them is they're both recognised by the Australian government here as accredited units for any company in Australia to offset their products, services, events, or other activities that they may be doing. So those two have very strict and stringent rules around them in place in terms of what evidence they must provide and regular updates to them. If they do not do those projects will lose their accreditation status and therefore become less worthy in their value of those credits. So you're really looking for accredited offset programs.
That's fantastic. I've got a question here from Jane Edwards. She's based in Miami and she runs a carbon offsetting agency. So I think her question is a general question to us, sort of Lisa and possibly myself, is how is the art world also intending to educate investors and consumers of the importance of addressing carbon offsetting when they engage in the art world? I mean, I think I could probably sort of start for that a little bit. I mean, I do hope that talks like this that we're doing here with Art Power Hong Kong, you know, the groups Kiri and all the partners, I hope that this is a start in terms of how we're sharing information and we can help educate. And I think partnering with people like you, Michael, and Jane, you know, perhaps your agency, carbon offsetting agency, can share more information. I think that information sharing in this particular area within the art community would be really invaluable. And hopefully this could potentially be a bit of a start of an ongoing forum that we have of information sharing and perhaps us all sort of embracing a bit of a pledge to have a best practice within the art world. I don't know if you...
Yeah, I think industry that's very light with this discussion. I think probably because the fear that it evokes, because you know, there are, as a sculptor, you really, you know, I've worked in plastics in the past. I work in bronze, which is, you know, alloys that are dug out of the earth. You know, we have bubble wrap for shipping. We fly things. We've got art fairs. It's a very wasteful community in a way. And what I'm personally going to do from this point on is have my projects offset, and I'll be building those into my budget. So when I go to a client and I have a budget for if it's an art project or an exhibition, or even a Creative Victoria, if anyone's listening from Creative Victoria, watch out, I'll be putting them in my budgets. but I'm going to encourage those communities that they should expect that to be part of the package now, that we have to incorporate these offsets as part of our overall budget.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, there's another question for you, Lisa, a little bit on that. I mean, Anita Lamb is saying, you know, that their studio creates digital art installations, and she wants to ask you how you cope with the challenges between clients given the budget and the creation lead time, as well as your carbon footprint, as it's something obviously she finds very challenging. Perhaps you can sort of ask her how. I mean, it is a challenge, I'm sure, is what you're going to say.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, so the question is,
yeah, how do you cope with that challenge?
Work out the could you, sorry, it's cutting in and out. So the question just, it says my connection is unstable. So the question is, with my projects, with the time frame to do with carbon offset, how I work it out, is it?
They obviously find, and I think this is probably all of us, you know, timelines tend to be very tight, budgets tend to be, you know, very tight. And so then trying to do the right thing in terms of the environment, I get, you know, that's
very hard.
It's just something else that you've got to juggle.
Absolutely, and especially with shipping, you know, like with this project, David Greybeard, until COVID-19, it was being launched in Melbourne at the then it was going to be straight away touring to Vienna, and then from Vienna it was going to Marseille, and it was going to Bordeaux. Each of those, there was only a couple of weeks in between each of those locations, and we had no other option than to fly the work.
Yeah.
And that's why Michael, you know, he calculated that offset as a flight. Now with COVID-19, we've actually got a lot more time in between each venue and location. So we will definitely ship the work now, which is a fantastic outcome of COVID-19. It gives us that space and time you need, but it's often not possible. And we've talked about this, Sarah, too, that timing is just, it's really hard to do the right thing because of that timing issue that often happens in the art world.
I think that, you know, that could be one thing in discussions that we've had with other people within the art community. Time is something that comes up again and again. And I think given more time and more space between our various activities and events and demands on our industry sector, that's almost the biggest gift that we can give ourselves and we can give the industry, because that does enable you to plan properly, to ask the questions that Michael is prompting us to ask about the decisions that we make in everything that we plan and do. And I think it is building it into the project too, rather than having it as an afterthought where you go, okay, I've done all this work, and then you go, oh my God, I've got to offset it. And, you know, what am I going to do? I've got to calculate it. And then, you know, is to actually build it into the whole project right from the beginning. Yeah. Now there's a few, I don't know if we've got enough time. Sorry, I saw some on questions, and now there's some others that I'd actually missed. Rosanna, you would, oh, here we go. What are the prospects for public artist advocacy, climate advocacy or otherwise, now while we're in the middle of COVID-19 pandemic, and thus need to stay away from from spaces to preserve everybody's health? That comes from Jamie. Actually, we talked about this, and I think lots of people talking about the impacts of sort of COVID and how it makes you reassess things. And one of the things that I know, Lisa, we were talking about with your project is it's the big impact. You don't have to be squashed together in a small space to engage with this artwork.
This work, where, you know, when it was meant to be up now, actually coming down today, I think today was today is Earth Day, I think. So was that when the virus first started rearing its ugly head, but it still wasn't at the level that it is now, we were talking about having it up, and the fact that people could still even drive past, so they could be in their own capsule and drive past and see the work. I mean, that is the beauty of a public work, is that it is outdoors. People can create the space that they need to look at that work. It's not an internal place that's obviously dangerous at the moment, and there's so much need, more and more, for so many reasons, for the public works outdoors, whether it is projection or whether it's a physical work or a soundscape. There's a lot of, and I'm on the board of a museum here, which is an outdoor sculpture park, and we've just been talking about the benefits of having that park open fairly soon and allowing people to go through that nature reserve and see sculpture and art in these open environments.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, we're also working together on a big public art project, and Jamie, to sort of answer your question, we are taking, in a way, it lets us consider that. How can we still have art and public art, which does have a fantastic place in terms of advocacy for various issues, and how we can still engage with the art world, engage with the public, but do it in a way that is safe, and I think one of the good things about working with artists is we come up with creative solutions.
Yeah.
And I think partnering with the scientists and experts like Michael and other people within his sector, I think if you bring those together with that creativity, there's no reason why we still can't come up with some fantastic solutions.
Yeah.
I know there's another question here, which I think we're now at our time limit, so this will be the last one. Rosanna's asking about whether there are companies or experts that we can recommend as advisors for calculating the carbon footprint and environmental impact in a similar way to you, Michael. I think what I would like to do is this is for our Hong Kong audience, and just from talking to people about this talk, I've been introduced to quite a few different partners, and I think what we would like to do, I'll speak to the Art Power community, and maybe we can actually come up with some pointers and Michael can help me on this as well, maybe recommend good, carbon offsetting programs, maybe introduce, have a list of kind of contacts of people that we've become aware of, and that maybe the community can add on to that sort of database in a way so that we can share that information.
Yeah, so I guess the first port of call is often the carbon offset providers themselves. So searching, a simple Google search in your local area of the carbon offset providers. Like, I think we had that question earlier from Jane, who does run a carbon offsetting agency. So she would probably be a relevant person in that local area for those projects. So those who offer the projects are often, or have an arm of their business that would be more than willing to help. And then additionally, I guess, like Lisa reached out to us at the university, so local tertiary institutions are probably a good starting point as well, or at least they can direct you in the right direction for another provider or a private provider potentially.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think in Hong Kong University, we've already been given some contacts there, and hopefully there's some people listening today from Hong Kong U. So I think, I mean, that seems to be all we have. We've now reached our time limit, so we'll wrap up today's talk, but I really hope that this has kind of provided a bit of a platform now for maybe further discussions on this subject. But Michael and Lisa, I can't thank you enough. It's been so interesting going through this sort of project process, and obviously the David Greybeard project we hope to see soon.
Yes.
We'd love to bring that to Hong Kong. I think it's a really meaningful project on so many different levels.
It's becoming more and more meaningful, really.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe in the best way possible, maybe Michael, you could come and be part of a kind of conversation about this project.
Yeah.
Offsetting your carbon, of course, when we get you to fly.
Yes, definitely. I'd love.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah and Art Partners. And
thanks everybody for joining in. And if I've been technically illiterate and I've missed your questions, I do apologise. I'll try and get back and answer that online. Okay.
Thank you. And thank you, Michael.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me along.
Bye.
Okay.
See ya.